First of all, though, let me switch over and get rid of my excess toolbars. Let's see. Oh, is that up here? There goes the web developer toolbar. There goes the bookmarks toolbar. And I don't dare take away the address toolbar or I'll be lost. Oh, status bar stays. We got to know where we're going. Okay. Can everybody hear me? Like everybody else, or nearly everybody else, I spent a lot of time trying to talk over music last night in a fairly loud place, so I hope you will forgive my voice. It's not usually a little bit raspy like this. Just let me know if you're not hearing things. I'm a reasonably comfortable speaker. That doesn't necessarily mean good, but comfortable, so do not fear interrupting me. If you think it's going to be long, though, save it for the question and answer period. But I'd be happy to take questions as we move along on topics. I'm going to violate a lot of the brain rules for those of you who've read this book because I'm going to do bullets. And my only excuse is that I figured you'd still be awake this morning. I am, however, going to try and break this into about 3 shorter talks. So you can pretend that I'm just giving 3 8-minute talks if you're worried about falling asleep. And I hope you're not. I'm going to be covering the past, the present, and the future. By the past, what I'm really going to try to do is to show you where Plone Form Gen came from, some of its roots. I mean that to give credit to people who worked on this, but also to penetrate some of the mystique. Plone Form Gen is not really my invention. It's just an iteration of a history of form generators, and it uses a lot of community tools. Then when we get to the present, I'm going to talk about the ways in which people have actually been using Plone Form Gen. I may be talking about things you've already done, or maybe some of it will be new to you. I'm not actually going to be showing any code. I'm mainly going to be trying to get across what's possible in hopes that you'll go home and do it, or read the documentation, or ask me about it. Then for the future, I am going to be shamelessly promoting the sprint. I'm going to be working on Plone Form Gen with Andrew Burkhalter, among other people. Anybody who would like to work on it is welcome. We can use people with all sorts of talents and experience levels. There may be code written, but I will be very happy if we just trace out the architecture for the future and make some sketches of what we want the UIs to look like in the next generation. So let's really get going now. Plone Form Gen. Who's heard of Formulator? We now know the old Zopeds in the room. And now I'm going to mispronounce a name, undoubtedly. Martijn Fassen. Chris, do you know better? Does that sound about right?
Yes.
Okay, I'm amazed. He is one of the lions of Zope, and certainly the lion of Zope in Germany. He's one of the people who makes has made the Zope user group there run. He's one of the Grok people. In fact, he may be the first one to come up with the idea. And years ago, he was just a Zope coder like several others of us, and he did a wonderful product. You undoubtedly are not going to be able to see the details. That's just the product screen up there. Unfortunately not. We have a relatively low power projector, and if we back it up much further to make it bigger, you won't be able to read it. It'll get too dim. You can't read it anyway. Well, I'll try and describe it to you. What you're looking at right now is the Zope management interface and a form folder. What it didn't call it then, but a formulator has been created, and there is a drop-down list of all of the kinds of fields you could add to it. It was a great list. You can see how the fields are organized inside the form. This is just a particular field and how you could set it up in it. Note that this is using Zope property sheets. Everything was done with Zope property sheets, which were easy for those of us who understood Zope property sheets and not for anybody else. That was all the help that you could apply with it, but you could do some very sophisticated things with the fields. Originally, Zope did not have ordered fields inside folders, so Martin worked out a fantastic way of creating groups of fields and being able to reorder them. It could be extremely tedious to use it, but that wasn't Martin's fault. It was extremely, or Martine, yeah, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It was very ingenious. It also had a set of overrides. Those of you who have used Plone FormGen will recognize the idea of the concept of overrides. You could fill in tails to override the fields. It really took some figuring out how to use it, though, because filling out a property sheet was all you had to work with. Otherwise, you had to dive into the code to do it. And again, not really the creator's fault. Those were the tools available at the time. You could make some great-looking forms because you could override the appearance of it. They validated. It was great. We used it for all sorts of things. I wrote add-ons that would file it into SQL databases. Anybody else do that sort of thing with it? Yeah. I mean, you could do a lot with it. It was a great tool. As soon as the Plone generation began, excuse me, some of us began trying to figure out how to reproduce that functionality inside Plone. And Jens Klein, and then another name I'll undoubtedly mispronounce. Are you here by any chance, Reinhard van Ries? Did the Van Rie brothers make it to the conference? Oh, that is sad. They worked out Plone Form Mailer. And Plone Form Mailer did a lot of great things. Plone Form Mailer was a wrapper around Formulator. The Zope Formulator was inside of it, and if you wanted to actually modify the form in any way, you had to go inside the Zope management interface and use Formulator to do it. But they figured out a way to render the whole form using the, actually that's CMF form controller, not CMF Formulator. They used CMF Form Controller to render all the forms and to do the actual validation, and that meant it looked like the rest of Plone. They gave you sample form content, which Martine did not do, and that made it a lot easier to figure out what was happening. And it had excellent mail functionality built in. And that was actually a real key. The original Formulator had no mailing functionality in it, couldn't mail the input of the forms. As a result, everyone who worked with it that needed a mailer that was connected to a form wrote their own mail add-on. And in fact, writing a mail add-on is full of danger. One of the main things that people do when they try to hack your system is to figure out how to turn it into an anonymous remailer. And any number of attempts at doing this got turned into anonymous remailers. And Jensen Reinhardt did a great job of building a mail add-on to it. However, a big problem was that you still had to use the Zope interface to do anything much with it, and the Zope interface was becoming increasingly impenetrable. So Plone Form Mailer, as Formulator before it, was a virtuoso tool. You really had to know what you were doing and really understand the system well in order to use it. At a certain point, I used Formulator a lot and decided that it was possible to create a product that would use a lot more of the Plone interface and a lot easier to work with. And that was the basic concept of Plone FormGen. It was born at a users group meeting where we were brainstorming about things to do. My great realization was that archetypes already contained a form generator and validation tools, so why not just reuse it? It wasn't quite that easy, but it was in there. Also, we needed multiple kinds of actions, and people came up with a lot of great ideas on the mailing lists, but we wanted to be able to not just mail with it, but to save data and do scripting very easily. Finally, this was a real goal of it. It needed to be simpler. It needed to be, I had the goal of better it be easy than complete. I knew that those of you who are developers could already create forms with CMF Form Controller. And then later on, we didn't have it then, FormLib and tools like that. So I wasn't really addressing developers with this tool. I was addressing people who needed to create a tool who could be used by the one or two people in the office that could get the idea of building forms inside a folder by just adding fields. The Plone FormGen architecture is really pretty simple. Fields are content types, and you throw them inside a form folder. Each field object contains an embedded archetype field inside it. Each field object knows how to render itself and how to validate itself. And that means that when we display a form and go through the form process, what the form folder is actually doing is it's just going through the list of ordered fields. It's asking them all to render themselves. It's adding them to the rendering of the form. And then when somebody submits, it asks each field to validate the input that came through it. And that's actually what I just said there for that last point. Then other part of architecture I just talked about, fields actions, the ability to do something. The action adapters are also content types. That means that they can be added, they can be deleted, they can be copied and moved from one form folder to another. They are not Z3 adapters. And I've taken some heat for using the word adapter to talk about action adapters, mailing adapters, save data adapters over the years. And my only reply to that heat is that I was trying to talk to people who were using this in an office. I still may have been too abstruse, but I wasn't talking to developers. So I wanted to use the term adapter in a way that would mean something to people who are using it. And so we have to talk down developers who think that I'm confusing the issue or that they should be ZOP3 adapters. Each action adapter has an onSuccess method. At the end of processing a form, the form folder just goes through and it calls the onSuccess method of every active action adapter, and then that adapter is responsible for doing its work. Part of what I had in mind there, as with the fields, is that people would be able to add on to Plone Form Gen, and that developers wouldn't have a tough time in plugging it in. We didn't have ZOP3 tools when I was doing it. This was originally all architected in Plone 2.1. I think, though, it was relatively easy inside that framework. Actions are executed in order. You can reorder them. Also, I don't know if everybody realizes this, you can have multiple action adapters. You can have multiple mailers sending off to different people. You can have saved data adapters that are differently configured, or where one of them you clear every once in a while and the other just saves up till the end of time. So the built-ins include the mailer, the saver, and the script. People have added all sorts of other things. That ends my part about the past. Consider your first short talk over. Reorient your mind. Let's talk about the present. Cool things that you can do with Plone Form Gen. And I'm not going to be showing you code. Again, I'm just going to be talking about the concepts and the things you can do. We can talk code later on, or maybe just knowing it can be done, you'll go home and just do it. Okay, extensions to Plone Form Gen. Andrew, show yourself off to people. Andrew Burkhalter has worked on a Salesforce adapter, along with the whole Seattle Mafia up there. And I hope he hasn't been cursing me too much as he's worked on it. It's been fun chatting back and forth with him about it. Is there anyone who doesn't know what Salesforce is? Okay, Salesforce is what's called customer relations management. It could be called constituent relations or client relations, depending on what you're trying to do. It is an extremely glorified content manager, although these days people use it as a full-fledged database. And what the folks who've been working on Salesforce Plone coordination have been doing is figuring out how to feed data from Plone into Salesforce and get it back to presented on the web when appropriate. And Andrew's crew has done this great job where you can create a Plone Form Gen form and get the result into Salesforce and match up the names and schema in the process. We have a product that adds CAPTCHAs. Andrew, did you work on that also? Or David Glick did. I don't see David in the audience. He's presumably attending a much better talk right now. Well, yes?
Just a quick question. The CAPTCHAs, are they local, or are they generated locally, or do they actually use CAPTCHA.net?
Let's see. They're using the Collective CAPTCHA project, which you can actually plug in different CAPTCHA systems. And I think out of the box it uses reCAPTCHA. Does anybody know better? Pardon? Ah, okay. The Gimpy library? Okay, so Skimpy Gimpy. So it's drawing its own at that point. However, I haven't done this myself. I actually abhor CAPTCHAs, but people who've worked with it told me it is easy to plug in different kinds, and people have used reCAPTCHA so that they can aid in digitizing the world's library and various other schemes. Get Paid. Is anyone using Get Paid? We've got at least one hand going up there. Get Paid is just basically a system for selling things through Plone. You can mark any content as sellable inside the system. And they have been using a connection to Plone FormGen so that you could create a folder to collect, or a form to collect information and then transfer it through the checkout process. So it's a great little add-on, and hopefully is working towards making Get Paid, a more mature product that's useful for all sorts of purposes. Okay, simple Plone FormGen tricks. Many of you may have already tried these. You can create your own ad hoc validators, and you can add defaults. Has everybody tried this? I can jump over and show what that looks like. I'm seeing lots of nods. Who would like to just real quickly see that? Okay, let me just jump over then. Okay, this is a test form, and actually this is pretty much what Plone FormGen creates when you create a new form. I can go over here to the Contents tab, and I can see my actual list of fields and adapters. And one of my fields here is an email address field that asks for your email address. This is how that field presents itself. And I can say that I want to edit it. Here where you make the basic changes for the field, the things that are meant to be accessible to nearly everyone. However, if you have the permissions, and by the way, if you're the administrator of your system, you can manage the permissions so that people don't see this. But if you have the permissions, you'll see an overrides pane. And in that overrides pane, you can write tails expressions. These are exactly the same expressions that are used in Zope page templates. Or you can write Python simply by saying Python : and writing Python. You can get at all of the information that's in your Zope database through this, everything that you've inherited. And here, just as an example, we have a default expression. This is probably hard to see, but it just says here/member email. Member email is just a little convenience method that picks up the email address of whoever's logged in, if they're logged in. If they're not logged in, it just returns empty. What that means is that if I'm using it, I'm going to see steve@dcn.org, all automatically filled in there. So we have a default expression. It could just be a static thing. It could just be a string, or it can be Python code picking up anything that you could write inside a Python script. For validators, you can just fill it in. You can write simple Python expressions to do a validator. You simply return one status if it validated, and if it doesn't validate, you return a string. That string is displayed as an error message. All of that works within the Plone conventions. It's using archetypes, which is basically Plone's default form library, to display these things. Again, just simple Python expressions to do that, or tails expressions to do it. You can write one-liners, or you can just call any Python script that you might have either accessible on the skin level or just sitting in that folder. Any questions about that? Okay. Back to my slides then. Okay, simple PFG tricks, ad hoc validators and defaults. Let's see. Multiple controlled, yes, sure.
If you add a validator, how do you pass the parameters to it?
That came from the form submission. They are all in a dictionary that's made available to you. You can just refer to the form. And the form is a dictionary, and it contains all of the input with the same IDs that you got when you were creating the form fields. So it's actually really easy to get at them with very short snippets of code. And for those of you, by the way, who have not visited the Plone FormGen documentation page, which is in the Plone FormGen Helps, or pardon me, the Plone Help Center, there are several examples of doing this sort of thing. And things get discussed on the list all the time. Oh, I was multiple controlled actions. I skipped that. You can have multiple action adapters inside a folder. Normally, they just get executed sequentially, but you can actually put in Python tests to determine whether or not an action adapter should execute, whether its onSuccess method should run. Why would you do that? Well, maybe you want to, for example, send the input of a form to completely different sets of people, depending on some of the responses in the form. You just do a simple test and run that mailing adapter to do it, to send to one person or to send to another person, or to have multiple and execute separately. Maybe you want to save the data some of the time and not other times. You can chain forms. This is a little bit tricky because you have to put in hidden fields. I would love to figure out how to make this easier. I think it's one of the things we can brainstorm at the sprint. But it is possible right now to chain one form to another form, so that as people push the submit button, they're taken to another form and the input to that point is remembered. You can even control which forms get executed in the process. That's a little bit tougher. You can turn fields on and off based on the context, and if you're chaining from one form to another based on previous submissions. You're going to have to write a little bit of logic to do it, but there are places for you to insert that logic or to do simple scripts that pull them in. You really shouldn't be scared of trying it. Yes?
I'm sorry, is that the same thing as hiding it?
Yes, hiding, but you can do it on the fly. You can do it with an override that tests your environment and determines whether or not you want to display a field. So, for example, you could display some fields to members of the site and not to anonymous visitors. That would be one easy application. Or if you had chained forms, you could look at the input from previous forms and determine whether or not to display certain fields. And then finally, SQL. Just doing some creation and update and, let's see, what's the R in CRUD? I'm looking over at Chris Reed, of course, reading. And there's a hopefully good tutorial. I wrote it, if you need someone to blame on doing that sort of work. Who's tried that sort of thing? I'm just interested. We've got a few. I get the impression, but maybe just from my mail, that's a very popular way of doing things, but maybe those are just the people I've confused enough to send me mail. Okay, amazing clone form gen tricks. And if you've got an amazing one I don't cover, maybe you want to stick up your hand and tell us about it. Injecting JavaScript and CSS into your forms for purposes of controlling presentation or doing slick things. I have seen form folders that inject JavaScript that on the fly, as input is made, turn fields on and off, hide them or display them, compute charges on the fly. Also, CSS to just do things like change colors of certain portions, align checkbox fields together so that they're on the same line rather than all being separate. Highly customized thanks pages. Yes?
Are there example codes for the JavaScript?
Yes, there are.
I didn't find any in the help desk thing.
Okay, just in documentation, or let's see, actually products, clone form gen documentation, we've got one on, it's fairly complex on doing JavaScript and CSS injection. Yeah, and if not, grab me afterwards and I'll point you to it. Yes? Clone form gen out of the box is, I mean, it's using some of the older widgets and archetypes, so there could be funky things in there that we need to fix. But generally, if your site is otherwise compliant, clone form gen is going to be fine. There are loads of IDs and selectors available for you to control the presentation if you need to.
Yeah, but I mean the JavaScript, CSS injection.
Whether your JavaScript and CSS injection remains compliant is dependent on what you write. That's strictly up to you. I'm not in control at that point. Okay, highly customized thanks pages. You know, when you create a form gen folder, it creates a thanks page being where you end up after the form has been submitted and the various other actions done. It's typically used to thank people for their input, could be used for all sorts of other purposes. It is a little known fact that you can customize that thanks page, customize its template, simply by copying the template out of the skins layer, dropping it in your folder, and then customizing it as you please. You can also chain to a template that you create completely separately. You can have it transfer to a page instead, and that page can have all sorts of decoration. But something about taking a template that you can do, a neat trick, is let's say you want to use PayPal or something similar in a very easy fashion. So you're accepting information about a contribution, and then you're taking people to PayPal to make the contribution, and it's okay with the workflow of your office that there'd be that extra step, and that they might not match up. you can simply copy that template that Plone FormGen uses to render the thanks page, put a copy in the folder, you're working at the ZOAP level now, and go put a PayPal button in it, complete with adding information that was submitted in the form in appropriate ways into the PayPal input. So if you've created a unique identifier in the course of processing this customer, you just put that in the PayPal information, and now you're going to be able to reconcile the PayPal contribution you get with the form input you received. It's really not a hard trick at all. I should probably document it better, but I've done it several times. Anybody else tried that trick? Yep, got at least one here. Posting to the outside world. There are a couple of ways you can do this. One is that you can just simply, as your final action in a form in the overrides, tell it where to go next, and it can go to somewhere else out in the rest of the world. But also there are several little adapters that people have written. I know one was written by Jeremy Kuiper, Chopin, on the Plone IRC channels, that posted directly to some payment services. Finally, creating content. Plone FormGen was not meant to replace archetypes or any other content generation scheme. That's not the use case behind it. However, people have discovered that there is a use case where they want to, for example, be able to collect information anonymously and then create content. And they don't want to give any of the permissions that would be involved in actually creating that content to anyone coming in anonymously outside the system. So they write a Plone FormGen form to take the information necessary, and then they write sometimes only 3 to 5 lines of code in a custom script adapter, and thanks to Miko Amada for adding that to Plone FormGen, and it can create a content type just using the simple methods that we ordinarily use to create a content type, just doing it through the factory and then just setting the attributes or calling the set accessors. It's pretty easy to do. I'm going to add a tutorial on that since it surprised me that people did it, but enough people have done it that I think I can now document it. When I did Plone FormGen, I wasn't really thinking of any of these things, so you folks have surprised me in your uses of it. Okay, Plone FormGen gotchas, the things that really I don't like about Plone FormGen right now. Please feel free to toss in the things you don't like about it. It is incredibly inefficient due to its Plone 2.1 architecture. If I'm really proud of something about Plone FormGen, it is that it has worked through 3 generations of Plone now, and you've had a clear upgrade path through all of that. There've been little gotchas, but I don't think it's ever broken anybody's forms moving from one generation of Plone to another. Am I correct? You feel free to scream in pain if I'm wrong. So I'm proud of that. But since Plone FormGen was created before we got events and adapters and FormLib, it's doing things in a very inefficient way. Every time you display a form, it is walking through all of the objects inside the folder, or at least all the field objects, finding them, asking them to render themselves. When it validates it, once again, goes through all of those objects. They're all heavy archetypes objects, and asks them to validate themselves. That means that if you really wanted to do some really high volume work with Plone FormGen, it would be a pain. I mean, you'd be working your processor, you'd be using a fair amount of memory to keep all of that cached, and it doesn't have to be that way any longer. It's not interactive enough also. I meant it to be easy to use. I've tried to make it easy to use. I've turned down feature requests like crazy to try and keep it easy to use. My bottom line is that we will not add a capability to Plone FormGen unless you can figure out a way to not make it any more complicated for the end user in the process. Nonetheless, I think that in my own training of people to use it, I've noticed that getting the idea of the form folder itself is hard for people. The fact that fields are just content, and people don't know what you mean when you say just content. Many of you probably trained people in your own offices to use it and seen this same sort of thing. I think we can do better now that we've got better interactivity tools in Plone. In particular, I think that we can use KSS and Ajax, I'll talk about that more in a moment, to do better. So I was already jumping a bit into the future, but that's the end of the present. Once again, you're through with another third of the talk. So reset yourself, and we can think about the future. This is going to go quickly. I want to use this. These are things that Andrew Burkhalter and I have been chatting back and forth about. I've spoken with a bunch of other people. Andrew's become a real collaborator in thinking about the future of this. And I've now moved into the evangelical part. I would like people to come and join us at the Sprint to be working these things through. We want to use the ZOAP 3 events architecture to avoid this problem of having to go through all of the fields of the forms as content types every time you display or validate or post. It's just ridiculous now. Instead, we know what's going on in a form, so when a form folder, when something is changed inside of it, we can use the ZOAP 3 event system to inform the form itself, and it can keep track of all of those things. Then when a form is displayed, there won't be any extra work. It'll just be one object getting woken up, used to display, used to validate, and used to start the actions going. I want to move to using ZOAP 3 schema rather than embedded archetypes fields to handle this. There are a whole variety of architectural reasons for this, but in particular, using ZOAP 3 schema is going to connect us to the whole world of development that's happening now. People are doing great work on FormLib and Z3C Form that are going to take us into the future. That's where the new interactive widgets are going to be coming from. We don't want to be tied to the old archetypes widgets. And I've already mentioned Z3C Form. It looks like a very attractive platform to be doing this with. I know that there's been some discouragement against using Z3C Form right now for work, and I can see why, reading the documentation and hitting some of its gotchas. But realistically, this next generation of Plone FormGen is at least 6 months out before you see it. And so I think Z3C Form will mature a lot during that time. Yep. Okay, finally, we have got a great AJAX tool. The work that the KSS people have done in making it easy for us to do client-server communication should make it very easy for us to activate inline editing on the forms. For one, I'm one of the people who think that the inline editing for Plone content has been a mistake, or at least we should have made it very easy. I'm getting some signals, running on time. Oh, okay. Oh, that was twinkling. Very good. John Stahl in the back. It doesn't work that well in Plone itself. However, when you're traveling to a spot and a form is popping up already, you're in edit mode already, it should be more interactive. The content should be, to the extent it can, being validated every time you move from one field to another, especially if we don't have to wake up objects to do it. Also, form editing itself, the process of creating the form, it should be possible to have a mode where we're displaying what the form looks like with some extra little widgets on it that will allow us to drag and drop so that you can add fields or move fields all inside the same screen. Maybe pop up little edit windows where you can do the major editing of a form field just right there on the page. I think that'll give us two things. One is that interactivity, the tangible process of doing those things, will tell people more about how it works, and they'll be able to visualize it better. And then also you'll be able to do a form much more quickly. You won't have to jump back and forth between your form and the contents tab and the individual fields. Also, here's my bottom line. I would love, I think that Plone FormGen has been a community process. A tremendous number of people have sent me patches or filed bugs that have helped make it better. I got a lot of ideas from people. It is a de facto community product. I would like to have more developers, though, actively working on the project. I'd like to see it become more collaborative going on. I would, however, like to play the release manager for it. And as release manager, my bottom lines are we must have smooth migration. So when we produce this next generation Plone FormGen that I'm talking about, there must be an easy migration path to migrate people's forms. So there are far too many people doing far too many things with this. We cannot strand them. Also, and this is again another bottom line, it has to stay simple. Whatever we're figuring out how to do, whatever we add to it, it must add no complexity, no additional complexity. If we do find a case where we really need to add the complexity, we need to find a way to hide it from the users who don't need it. We can already do that somewhat with the role connections that you can make on the Plone Form Gen configlet. We may have to do more of that, but in any case, the goal is that just about any office you go into, any small not-for-profit, that there's probably going to be one person in the organization who is going to be able to figure out how to create forms and maintain them. You may have to help them if you're a developer on doing some of the back-end actions, but they'll be able to modify the forms themselves. And we've got to not lose that in the course of making it fancier or faster. We want to work with Dexterity. Martin Espelli is doing some great work on Dexterity. I'm not exactly sure how we will work with it. I'm hoping we can share some code back and forth. But also, I think it would be great if you've built a form with Plone Form Gen that you're using at one point to just solicit information and you'd like to turn it into a content type. Plone Form Gen should be able to export a format that you could plug into something like Dexterity immediately and have it become a content type. That could also allow for a very fast interactive development cycle where you could show people what it looks like and then quickly turn it into a content type. So that's not the end of the future. I've commented it out. Because I want your help, I want to work with you. I hope you'll come to the sprint. If you can't make it to the sprint, or if you're sprinting on something else, how could you? Please send ideas. I love to get them. You can file bugs on the issue tracker. Sometimes I'm distracted and I don't get to those for a while, but I do try and do release cycles where I kill all the bugs I can before doing a new release. Translations are always welcome. I love to get translations, and if you're having any trouble with the I-18 machinery of the product, tell me. I will fix it. I am an ignorant American in many ways, but I'm completely devoted to having this be I-18N compatible. So that's it. We're at 9:58. I think we end at 10:10. Is that correct? So we've got 10 minutes for questions or for leaving early or for whatever you want to do. Yes, Paul.
Yeah, is there an idea on how to, a preferred way of sort of adding onto it things that it can spit out? I've hacked a way to spit out SQL statements so that I can create a table for grab things.
Yes.
But, I mean, it's easy and it's, but do you have any ideas?
So
We're going to have a Dexterity export button.
Yes.
SQL export button.
Right. The question was whether or not there was an easy way to get it to spit out SQL to export. And by that you mean so that you're sort of building, you might think of yourself as building your rows when you build the form, and you export or create, have it export or create, and also create the methods. I haven't been planning it. It is certainly a feasible thing to do. I think that's one of the examples of an add-on that we could do it without adding to the complexity, because we'd be able to hide it from anybody that doesn't want to do that at all. So there'd be no problem in adding it. I think what we need is someone to work on it. I do SQL interactions infrequently enough that I don't need it. So I'm not the person who'll push that. If you'd like to push it, though, I will be very happy to work with you or anybody else. Chris.
So the history of pretty much all these tools is to stack up a lot of widgets simply vertically, and every time I use a tool with ZopaPlone that does something like this, and I show it to my customers, immediately what they're wanting to do is they want some more sophisticated layout of it. They don't want to, if they have a form with 5 fields on it, why do I need to scroll? There's a sort of an implicit need to have sort of X, Y, at least placement of widgets on a screen. And do you envision Plone Form Gen ever facilitating something like that, or is that something deferred to? Okay, well, you get your Skinner to work on that, and then you sort of take the power out of the user's hands to generate forms.
Right. Could people hear Chris? I'd be happy to repeat it. Okay. In Plone Form Gen, as with other forms in Plone in general, you get a very vertical presentation of the fields and the field widgets as you're going to be filling them in. It's just one line after another line. And Chris was pointing out that in many cases, especially when you've got a small number of fields, you'd like a different layout of that information to work with. And I think to a certain extent, the answer is Plone Form Gen aims to be easy. And so we may never give people adequate control over presentation for doing, really nice work. Also, we have to work within the sort of standard Plone form framework. We want it to by default look like the rest of Plone, and the way in which we validate and give people feedback on validation problems is right now structured around a vertical construction of them. So it's unlikely that Plone FormGen is going to be itself dramatically changing those. And so for right now, the solution has been that you ask someone who knows CSS to come in and inject some CSS into it that will change the presentation. If we can get ideas on ways in which we can continue to generally work with the Plone scheme for forms and validation and give people more flexibility, I would absolutely love it. This is not a matter of principle. The only principle is just staying simple.
So you just said a phrase right there that I don't think anybody generally acknowledged might exist, and that is the Plone form framework. So we sort of even have difficulty acknowledging there's a Plone framework at times. So where do you see the Plone form framework coming from? What is responsible for that?
Chris was asking if we have a Plone form framework, where is it coming from? We've actually had several technical frameworks over the years, but one thing that's remained relatively consistent is the way in which we have users interact with forms. And I don't know who did the original design on that. I don't know if it was Leamy or somebody else, but the way we do it inside Plone is that we have sequential fields going vertically, and then when we do validation, and we have a little help set up that gets darker when your cursor runs over it. You can, of course, change the CSS. And then if there's a validation problem, we show the validation problem right at the field by surrounding that whole field. That's a standard we've kept for several versions now. I think people like the way it works with, in terms of getting good validation interactivity. But there's nobody that's ruled that's the way it has to be, I don't think. Does that generally get at it?
Get some information, yes.
Okay. You can grab me later. Any other questions? Yes.
A lot of form frameworks have CSRF protection.
Mm-hmm.
Because you got that, were you aiming to?
That's another thing we should be adding immediately to Plone FormGen. It's not built in right now. Okay, sorry. It was pointed out that Plone, in its own forms, the ones that come built into Plone, the ones that are important, we now have CSRF protection, cross-site request forgery protection, which is a protection against using your browser window from another spot to basically cause you to file a form and change something in the system. That should be very easy to add to Plone FormGen. All the tools are inside Plone 3 to do it with. We can probably even get that into the current version of Plone FormGen rather than waiting for the next generation. So good question. Definitely a doable thing. Yes?
Can it work with content rules in some way?
Right now, I haven't built in any interaction with content rules. I don't know anybody else who has with it. Maybe we can think of some ways to do that.
We're using both a lot. I mean, FormGen and content rules, so.
Yeah, right now, the only sort of way you could do it is in a script or a line of script, detect the environment and then make it behave differently. There might be some possibilities there. Once again, the bottom line is whether or not we can figure out a way to do it that'll be simple and that people will understand. Yes, John.
I just realized that there might be some connections between the idea of kind of a new Ajax UI for Plone FormGen and Martin's need for a new Ajax UI for Dexterity. I don't think they're the same, but there might be some opportunity.
And Martin and I have been talking about that, and Martin has been very generous in offering up code examples on how to do that, and I think we absolutely should leverage what he's doing with Dexterity in every way we can. I mean, ideally, among other things, all of these things in Plone that we do should share as much as possible, particularly of the user interface metaphors, so that we stay easy throughout it. I mean, Plone FormGen levers the user interface metaphor of folders and folder content. It leverages the whole experience of that and of being able to move content around and delete it and copy it and paste it from one to another. We need to keep that up. Dexterity the work Martin's doing on Dexterity is very attractive. We should borrow as much as we can, and ideally we should be able to contribute back some too.
You both, you both have the need to build a UI that actually is going to offer that needs to offer pretty similar things, and neither of you have it yet.
Yes.
So there might be some.
Yep. Martin and I are definitely trying to stay in communication about that. That's a goal. He doesn't want to write more code than he needs to. I don't want to write more code than I have to. And as I say, we want the things to behave in a similar way. So I really hope that will continue to happen. More questions? Okay, we're done. Thank you all very much.